Okay, so I'll kick off. So Glyn will introduce himself properly when he begins to talk, but what we're talking about in this workshop session, and we've got about 45 minutes, I'll keep an eye on the time, is the essential message is to keep the carer in mind. So that's really the message we want to push home. So what we're going to explore initially is through a relatively slim slide deck is some of the learning from the carers thematic SAR. And I think if you had the advanced information, there was a link to the carers thematic SAR. So obviously I referred to this earlier, but this looked at 3 cases where there was a carer involved in a fairly complex care scenario in most cases, but the individual was showing that kind of pattern of self-neglecting behaviour. Glyn, part of the reason why Glyn is presenting with me is because Glyn was part of the review panel. So when you conduct a Safeguarding Adults review, there's a review panel who supports the author, and we have that dialogue throughout. And Glyn has that expertise and represents Carers Manchester, the Carers Manchester network, but he'll explain more in a moment, and then you'll actually be able to see him. So that's what we're aiming for. I just want to say we want to try and make this quite an informal, relaxed session. Because what I want to draw out once we finish presenting is kind of some of your own practice experiences that we can discuss in the round. And they might be dilemmas for you at the moment. They might be things that you've worked with in the past that you thought, actually, I was really pleased with the way that turned out. That really worked. So this is all about sharing those practice experiences once we've kind of got through the information giving. So the other key message, as well as keeping the carer in mind, is to improve the early identification of and support for carers, because I think that was one of the really evident issues, which I'll go on to talk more about. I think very often, and I think this isn't just typical of these SARs, I think very often carers can be overlooked. And that's partly because the legal framework and the person with the most evident needs is the one that they are looking after, the person that they're. But there are lots of complicated dynamics, I think, around some of those relationships and the way we interact with carers. So I'm going to talk through the learning from the Carers Thematic SAR, which was published, I think, probably a couple of years ago now. And because of the pandemic, there were kind of 3 reasonably historic cases. They didn't go back years and years, but, you know, they were kind of pre-pandemic. So we really want to develop and support our shared understanding and awareness about the challenges of family caring, but specifically from the carer's perspective and trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the family carer. And then with that kind of thinking about what you can do as a practitioner to support them. And the really important bit of this session, which Glyn will be leading, is to understand the support that is available. There is quite a good network in Manchester, and that the network has high ambitions in terms of what it can provide for carers to support them. So, so the learning from the Carers Thematic SAR, these are kind of the key points I'm going to pull out. So most of you will be familiar, hopefully, with the idea of a carer's assessment. So this was something that was introduced with the Care Act. And I think it was partly introduced as a way of kind of creating that parity. That was what the Care Act, kind of the spirit of the Care Act, I think, tried to do, was to create parity between the carer and the cared for. And carer's assessment is a way of acknowledging and supporting carers. And we'll talk a bit more about that later, because I think the term assessment is quite difficult sometimes. But one of the key pieces of learning was that 2 of the carers of the 3 had actually been providing long-term support to their loved one in quite a difficult and challenging care situation, and essentially had not been recognised, and they'd not had a carer's assessment. And the care assessment is almost like the first line of action. Because it allows the individual carer to talk about their care experience and to talk about their well-being. And of course, the carer's assessment is a focus on the individual, the carer as an individual, not their caring, if you like, responsibilities. So I've already touched on the fact that carers were often overlooked by practitioners. But I think what was perhaps surprising about that in these 3 SARs is that the family member that was providing that care there were really intensive level of care needs and support needs, including in some cases issues, really significant issues with mobility, lifting and handling and that sort of stuff. And then that individual was also showing some level or some degree of self-neglect. So in some of those cases, there was one in particular, it was the case of Colin that was referred to this morning in the presentation for those of you who were there. The level of care and intervention was really, really significant. And in actual fact, it was probably too demanding for that family carer. And part of the reason we drew that conclusion was because they'd missed kind of key symptoms to the point where the individual, Colin, actually his life was kind of, threatened by that because she didn't call an ambulance and things like that. Now, in that situation, it's probably easy to think, oh, well, the carer wasn't doing what they should have done. But actually, the way we looked at it was actually this was too much for this individual. And she actually, when she eventually did get a carer's assessment, she said that she essentially said, this is very difficult, for me, and I'm not sure what I'm doing really. So there's something in there about, really looking at what the carer, what the level of care, the demand of care is required on behalf of the family member and whether they feel able to deliver that level of care, particularly if it requires constant monitoring of the individual, if it requires things that feel like more clinical in nature and interventions, so injections, and also a couple of the carers were providing care throughout the night. So continuing with the learning then, 2 of the carers, I mentioned isolation before, but that sense of isolation and having nowhere to turn was the same for the carers. So quite a few of these families were kind of the couple was isolated, and the carer's assessment, when it was undertaken in a couple of the cases, made it very clear that the individual carer had no time for themselves. One of them, as I recall, was also trying to manage a part-time work. So their own health and well-being was, quite severely affected by this very kind of heavy burden of care. So in all the cases, and this was a feature of the self-neglect, the cared for family member persistently refused health and care services and support. And it was noticeable that was often in favour of the family carer. But the effects of that on the carer were very rarely explored and the demands of that, hence keeping the carer in mind. So this last point really, it's trying to help us to think about things a little bit differently, because in one of the family care situations, the carer recognised and said that there was a little bit of a kind of a control issue going on. And I've said here a degree of unhealthy emotional control over the carer. And I think we wouldn't normally think that. We would normally assume that the vulnerable person, the person with the primary care and support needs, they wouldn't have that relationship with the person that was caring for them. But as part of this review, we did a consultation with a group of kind of expert care organisations, and some of them confirmed that and said, actually, it's not, it's unusual, but it does happen that the individual with the care needs actually does begin to kind of there's a bit of element of controlling behaviour. So sometimes, I guess what the point of raising that is to reflect on the fact that family care dynamics, even our own family care dynamics, let alone other people's, can be really complex. And sometimes things aren't always what they seem. And I think kind of getting under the skin of that, if it's possible for you as a practitioner, is it's worth trying to do, or worth trying to think of things from a slightly different perspective. So key messages for practice. And I think, again, this first point, this first point came out in the consultation we did with the kind of experts by experience, the carers organisations. And what they said was that there needs to be a recognition that caring for someone who is self-neglecting can be additionally, really demanding beyond the norm. But it's also very upsetting for them and can leave them feeling very vulnerable. And one of the ways that people express that vulnerability is when someone else comes into their home and sees their loved one who appears to not be properly cared for. Will services, will professionals perceive that as neglect on their part, which I think is a really valid point. And actually, that might be the first thing we come to. It might be, well, you're not being properly cared for, And I know that there isn't, I'm saying that in a very judgmental way. I know people wouldn't necessarily say that out loud, but that might be the first thought that you go to. So bear in mind that, the carer can feel really vulnerable when they are caring for their loved one who is self-neglecting, and they recognise that they're self-neglecting. So really get to know the family carer and value their expertise and knowledge. So, there's this narrative which is really important and value about recognising the carer as an expert in the care of their loved one, and then provide that holistic care to both the cared for and the carer. Don't be afraid to use professional curiosity in a conversation with the carer. Sometimes it might just be taking them aside or following them into the kitchen and just saying, how are you coping? And they may actually then begin to talk freely about some of their coping capacity and stress that they're under. This came out from one of the learning points earlier. So periodically review the carer's capacity to provide the level and type of care required, particularly if those needs have changed and have become more intense. And the language around carer assessment, if you want to encourage someone to have a carer assessment, it might actually be better to rather than use that term, say, could we take you through a process, kind of a structured conversation, which enables us to look at your needs as a carer and which will help to bring our attention to your health and well-being. Carer's assessment, I think, can put a lot of people off the idea of an assessment. Refer people to carers to local specialist support. There's an abundance of it in Manchester, which Glyn is going to talk more about in just a moment. And a really final but really instructive point is that be aware that many family carers will just find it impossible to admit or say that they can no longer feel able to provide care for their loved one, or no longer want to, which is also a perfectly legitimate way to feel, and particularly if you've been in a long-term care situation. My feeling is that there is a role for professionals, and there could have been a role for professionals within these scenarios that we saw in the safeguarding adult reviews, for professionals to kind of act in it's almost like an informal advocacy role, but actually enabling the carer, giving them permission to come to terms with their situation, that this is no longer a safe situation for them to care in, and suggest this, consider and suggest alternative care options. And it might not necessarily be taking someone into residential care. It might be actually, would it help if we had, if you had, or we assessed you for, a couple of sessions of home care, or we got more aids and adaptations. It's not already it's not immediately kind of like the thing that everyone fears, which is their loved one being taken into care and no longer being able to be at home with them. It might be actually you could find something to recommend, which is a step, a step towards accepting care. So I'm going to allow. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment because I seem to have lost my connection with. I'm going to stop presenting. And then I'm going to turn myself on mute if I can.
Can I just check that everybody can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Bear with me. I'll turn my mic off, Glyn, and my camera so people can see you.
Can everybody see the slide?
Yeah.
Right, so to start with, my name's Glyn Meacher. I actually work for GADM, which is one of Manchester's oldest charities. And my role within GADM is to actually act as service manager for those services which GADM provide to Carers Manchester, but also have a role as coordinator of the pathway, which I'm going to describe in the next 4 slides. And as Sarah said, I also acted as an advisor to the SAR, which looked at caring and self-neglect. So background, Carers Manchester is actually a formal partnership of both statutory and voluntary organisation working towards improving services for Manchester's unwaged carers. So the partners are Manchester Local Care Organisation, the City Council, Greater Manchester Mental Health, but also then 14 voluntary sector organisations who operate in the city, who all provide support to carers, and that support varies considerably depending on the nature of the organisation and the funding that they receive, but I'll go through that in a minute. And then emerging out of our Manchester Carers strategy was this new pathway for carers in the city to both receive advice, guidance and support. So can we move on, Sarah, please? So the pathway in action is based on 5 key areas of work. So the first is that there's a vibrant communications and marketing strategy wanting to identify hidden carers within the city. And that emerged from the strategy. The census identified some 60,000 carers, approximately 10,000 in touch with services. So there's a real need to actually let carers know about the services which are available to them. Right. So the second part is actually GADM has a role of coordination of the carers network organisations. We also run a learning and development programme. But then key to the support available to carers in the city is actually the support which is provided by these 18 organisations. And then also emerging from the strategy is that what carers told us they wanted in 2019 was a single point of contact for carers. So the Manchester Carers Contact Point went live in August 2020. And like I've described, what it's actually given both professionals and carers is one place to ring to get advice, information, and as Sarah touched on before, that can be in advance of any carer's assessment. I think that's slightly different for carers who are caring for people with very high level and complex needs, such as issues of self-neglect, where it's absolutely essential that that support is framed through the carer's assessment. But there's also a lot of support which can be delivered by voluntary sector and community organisations which can support the carer as well as that support which is accessed through the carer's assessment. The fourth bit is local partnerships, each led by a lead partner, and again I'll touch on that shortly. And then again, absolutely key in the cases we've heard about this morning is that centralised statutory assessments in adult social care, and also working with Greater Manchester Mental Health as well. So what I'm going to try and do is touch on the support which is offered by 3 of that pieces of the jigsaw. So if we start with the contact point is delivered by a partnership between GADM, LMCP, Manchester Carers Forum and YIN. It can be accessed via telephone helpline, email, website and social media, and details about the contact point will be included in the pack of information which is sent out after the conference. So the aim of the contact point is not that formal assessment, it's of that initial conversation with a carer designed to actually have a look and assess what carer support need they might have. So the sorts of things which can follow that conversation are registration. So we've got a carers database that we can actually access with carers can register with consent to allow us to provide information to them. And we run 2 newsletters, a fortnightly email newsletter and also a quarterly printed newsletter. And again, copies of those will be included within the pack. Within Carers Manchester, we've got a welfare benefits officer, and the access to that welfare benefits officer, the Carers Emergency Fund, and a range of information about grants. It can actually be provided through that phone call with the contact point. As said previously, we run a learning and development programme, which is coming to an end of its initial funding, but hopefully will receive future funding. And then again, what's absolutely key to the contact point is that referral and that signposting to organisations who offer that additional support within the community to all of Manchester carers. But then very specifically, right, the contact point acts as a first point of contact for both referrals for carers assessments, but also for those carers who are requesting a review. We work very closely with the City Council's care managers team, and actually, where needed, can access carers assessments on a same-day referral process. We move. The second part of the support, which is available to both carers and organisations in the city, right, is actually around. I've just looked at the question. Is actually about coordinating the network. So the 18 voluntary sector organisations range from a variety of national charities, often condition specific, like the Stroke Association, the Alzheimer's Society, local Manchester-based specific care organisations. So these will provide a variety of support. They include Manchester Carers Forum, Manchester Carers Centre, Talbot House Unlifted, who provide support to parent carers of people with disabilities, Connect Support and Mood Swings, who provide support to carers of people with mental health issues. And then also the other, in effect, block of carers organisations who are part of the network are those community-based organisations who provide carers support as well as support to other vulnerable people or communities of interest. So the activities which the coordination function can offer to carers is this whole idea of comms. So we develop the newsletters, we organise events, so very much tied in with national carers dates. So we run a number of events in June as part of Carers Weeks. We always celebrate Carers Rights Day, which is in November. We host and develop the Carers Manchester website, and there's a number of fact sheets on the Carers Manchester website, which will help carers self-support. And our commitment after this conference is to actually develop a new fact sheet, which will be around caring and caring for people where self-neglect is an issue. And we'll actually learn from the contents of this workshop and the conference as a whole. And again, as mentioned previously, one of the key offer to carers throughout the city is actually that direct support to carers, which is provided by our network members. But then also all network members, but the coordination function as well. We run a number of carers breaks for carers, and one of those is a partnership with the Halle, where we offer carers 50 free tickets to a concert on a monthly basis, and our local partnerships also do similar. Move on, Sarah. Then the final slide, which I wanted to mention, which again is another new part of in effect, the pathway to carers support, is this idea of carers locality partnerships. So there's 3 partnerships in the city, the North, Central and South, North is led by Manchester Carers Centre, South by Manchester Carers Forum, and Central by ACCG. And what they do is they actually work in partnership to support organisations at a local level, and they actually work in partnership with other network members to create a partnership locally. They have a key role about developing links with local teams and community-based organisations. Again, not easy. It really isn't easy to engage with your OGP surgeries, health professionals. A lot of really good work and really positive work, but a lot of times where it's really difficult to engage with key organisations. So to support that and identify carers, they do a significant amount of outreach. They're tasked to identify unmet need in the area. Both North Manchester Partnership and South Manchester Partnership ran questionnaires last year, which have resulted in a range of new support groups being developed in the city, both locality based but also condition specific. So the South locality have created support groups for carers of people with drug and alcohol issues and also carers of people with autism. And again, one of the things which is key, we want to position the contact point as that first point of contact for anyone who wants, for a carer who wishes to know what's available to them, but also a professional to refer to support from network members, but also for a carer's assessment if need. And then what also the localities do is offer carers cultural breaks. And Yin, who's their partner in the South, also offer a range of cultural awareness training for organisations around carers. So I think those are my 5 slides. Again, in the pack, there will be information. There will be our carers of people with self-neglect fact sheet delivered, but I'll hand over now to Sarah, who'll actually talk through what we wanted to discuss now.
Hi, sorry, it's quite difficult trying to manage several different screens in the background. Thanks, Glyn, that was great. So you can see from what Glyn presented, there is a lot of activity around support for carers in Manchester. Please tap into it because there's a lot of kind of valuable lived experience that forms part of that network and that offer.